Something is burning deep inside Russia right now, and it is not just oil. It is the carefully constructed financial architecture that has kept Putin's war machine alive for more than 4 years. For 3 straight nights, March 25th, 26th, and 27 of 2026, Ukrainian drones have hammered Russia's most critical energy arteries along the Baltic Sea, hitting the port of Ust-Luga, the port of Primorsk, and the Kirishi oil refinery in Leningrad Oblast. These are not random strikes. This is a precise, calculated surgical campaign against the economic jugular of the Russian state. And before you dismiss this as just another headline in an already exhausting war, let me tell you exactly why what is happening right now at this very moment may be the most consequential military and economic move since Russia rolled its tanks into Ukraine back in February 2022. Because this time, the fire is not in some distant frontline village you've never heard of. The fire is in Russia's money. And when a nuclear power's money starts burning, the whole world needs to pay attention. According to Reuters, Ukrainian drone strikes, pipeline damage, and tanker seizures have now halted roughly 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, equivalent to about 2 million barrels of oil a day. Let that sink in for a moment. Analysts are calling this the most serious threat to Russian oil exports since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter. You are watching, in real time, the most severe energy disruption in modern Russian history, and it is happening right now, this week, while most of America is distracted by something else entirely. Let me take you to the geography first, because geography is destiny, and in this story, the geography is everything. The port of Primorsk handles around 60 million tons of oil annually and is Russia's main oil export hub on the Baltic Sea. Ust-Luga is one of Russia's largest ports on the Baltic Sea and a major hub for exporting crude oil and petroleum products. These two ports are not just logistics centers. They are the veins through which Russia pumps its lifeblood into global markets, collecting the billions of dollars that pay for missiles, drones, North Korean soldiers, and all the machinery of the war that has been grinding Ukraine into dust for 4 years. The Kirishi oil refinery, which accounts for over 6% of Russia's total oil refining volumes, was struck on the night of March 26th. Key units, including primary oil refining units and gas fractionation facilities, were damaged. This is a facility that processes roughly 355,000 barrels per day. It is not a small target. It is not symbolic. It is existential. Now think about what this means strategically. Ukraine has been conducting a long and patient campaign to cut off Russia's ability to finance this war. And we need to understand something very clearly here. Russia does not fund its war machine through ideology. It funds it through oil and gas revenues. Every barrel of crude that flows out of Primorsk, every tanker that departs Ust-Luga, every refined product that moves through Kirishi, all of that feeds directly into the Kremlin's war budget. When those barrels stop moving, the money stops flowing. When the money stops flowing, the tanks stop rolling and the missiles stop launching. Since late 2022, Russia has built a shadow shipping network of hundreds of vessels that now transports about 3.7 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 65% of its seaborne exports and generating between $87 and $100 billion of annual revenue, more than the total economic and military aid the West has provided to Ukraine since the war began. That number should make every American sit up straight. Russia was making more money from oil than the entire Western alliance was spending to stop it. And Ukraine, with drones that cost a fraction of a Tomahawk missile, is now systematically dismantling that revenue stream piece by piece. But here is where the story gets even more layered, even more complex, and honestly, even more frightening. We are not living in a world with just one war right now. We are living in a world where multiple fires are burning simultaneously, and they are beginning to feed each other. Brent crude oil has already soared to nearly $120 per barrel, close to its highest point of $147 recorded in July 2008, driven by the US-Israeli war on Iran and the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that for a moment. You have the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day, now severely disrupted by the Iran conflict. And at the same time, you have Ukraine now knocking out another 2 million barrels a day from Russian export capacity. These are not separate stories. They are one story, and together they are creating a global energy shock that the International Energy Agency is already calling the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Now, here's the perverse irony that Pepe Escobar would call a masterpiece of geopolitical chess. Russia, whose oil revenues were being crushed by Western sanctions, had actually begun to benefit from the Iran war driving oil prices higher. Higher oil prices meant Russia could sell less volume and still make more money. Ukraine saw this very clearly. And so Ukraine responded by doing something extraordinarily bold. It went after the infrastructure itself. It is not enough to cut the price. You have to cut the pipe. Ukraine's intensified attacks on Russia's oil industry have continued even as Moscow began to see additional profits from the global supply disruption triggered by the war in Iran. This is the logic of total economic warfare, and Ukraine is executing it with a precision and an audacity that most Western analysts frankly did not think Kiev was capable of. And let us talk about the shadow fleet, because this is a story that the mainstream American media has almost completely ignored. On March 25th, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that Royal Navy ships would now seize Russian shadow fleet tankers, following interceptions already carried out by the United States, France, Finland, Sweden, and Estonia. The shadow fleet, those hundreds of aging, often uninsured tankers flying flags of convenience from countries like Gabon, Palau, and Panama, has been Russia's great evasion mechanism, its way of moving oil around Western sanctions. The West is now actively hunting those ships. And on top of that, a tanker carrying Russian crude oil was attacked by a drone in waters near Istanbul on March 26th, with an explosion reported in the engine room. Ukraine is not just hitting refineries and ports inside Russia. Ukraine is now projecting force into international shipping lanes. That is a completely different level of warfare. That is something that changes the entire maritime security calculus for every nation that sails through those waters. Now, let us talk about what Russia is doing in response, because Vladimir Putin does not absorb punishment passively. Russia has stepped up assaults in Ukraine's east in what may be the start of a spring offensive, and launched an air assault of record size against Ukraine's western cities, involving 948 drones and 34 missiles in a single 24-hour period. That is a record number. That is Russia essentially saying, you burn my oil, I burn your cities. This is the logic of escalation, and it is a logic that has its own terrible momentum. The attacks killed at least 5 people and wounded more than 40 across Ukraine, and yet Ukraine intercepted 91% of those 1,968 drones Russia launched during that same week. This is a nation that has become extraordinarily good at surviving what would have broken any other country in the world. But here is the question that every serious American analyst, every serious geopolitical thinker needs to be sitting with right now. Where does this escalation ladder end? Because there is a ladder here and people are climbing it. Russia is using nuclear-capable Oreshnik missiles. It fired one at Lviv, a city close to the Polish border. The UN Security Council condemned Russia's supersonic missile strike near the border of a NATO country, with Denmark warning that hitting a city only a short distance from NATO and EU territory is a reminder of Russia's recklessness. When you fire a hypersonic missile at a city that is within comfortable artillery range of a NATO member state's border, you are not just making a military statement, you are making a psychological statement. You are testing the will of the entire Western alliance. You are asking, how much will you take before Article 5 becomes real? And what does America's posture look like right now in this environment? This is where things get genuinely complicated. The Trump administration has been pursuing negotiations with Moscow while simultaneously, quietly, maintaining certain lines of military support for Kyiv. The Kremlin issued a proposal to halt intelligence sharing with Iran if the United States does the same for Ukraine, a proposal that Washington rejected. Moscow is trying to use the Iran conflict as leverage to cut Ukraine's lifeline. It is a cynical but brilliant geopolitical maneuver. Russia is essentially saying, let us both stand down from our respective proxy conflicts. But of course, Ukraine is not a proxy conflict for the United States in the same way Iran is for Russia. Ukraine is a matter of European security architecture, of international law, of the post-1945 order that says borders do not get changed by military force. These are not equivalent propositions, and Moscow knows it. Meanwhile, there remains no official ceasefire, no direct dialogue, and no direct agreements between Russia and Ukraine on any halt to hostilities. Zelensky has been unambiguous about this. The diplomatic track is moving, but it is moving through mud. And every day that it moves through mud, more people die and more infrastructure burns. Core political issues, including territorial control and security guarantees, remain unresolved. Russia still insists that Ukraine must formally abandon any aspiration to join NATO and must cede 4 regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, including territory Russia does not even fully control on the ground. That is not a negotiating position. That is a demand for unconditional surrender dressed up in diplomatic language. Now let us zoom out even further, because the truly terrifying thing is not what is happening in Ukraine alone. It is what is happening in the entire global system simultaneously. You have the Iran war disrupting the Strait of Hormuz and threatening global oil supply chains. You have Ukraine now destroying Russia's oil export capacity on the Baltic Sea. You have North Korea deploying actual soldiers into this conflict. North Korea has publicly acknowledged sending troops to fight for Russia in Ukraine, with Kim Jong-un presiding over a hero's welcome in Pyongyang for combat engineers returning from Russia's Kursk region, with up to 15,000 soldiers reportedly having served alongside Russian forces. Think about that. You have a second nuclear power, North Korea, now directly participating in a European land war. The lines between what people used to call separate regional conflicts are dissolving before our eyes. Russia's defense minister Andrei Belousov asserted that NATO has begun accelerated preparations for confrontation with Russia in the 2030s, creating real prerequisites for continued military action in 2026. Now, you can dismiss that as Russian propaganda, but you cannot dismiss the underlying reality it points to, which is that both sides of this conflict are now explicitly planning for a longer, wider war. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank that is careful about its language, has been documenting what it calls Russia's Phase Zero effort, the use of Belarus to probe NATO airspace, to test NATO response times, to set psychological and informational conditions for a potential future confrontation between Russia and NATO directly. Belarusian balloons have been violating Polish airspace since October 2025, including 5 times since January 27th, in what analysts assess is part of Russia's broader condition-setting effort for a possible NATO-Russia war in the future. Balloons crossing into Polish airspace. Think about that image for a moment. Simple, almost quaint, and yet deeply, deliberately sinister. The question that matters most to Americans watching this from across the Atlantic is very simple. Does any of this actually touch us? And the answer is brutally, uncomfortably yes. The price of benchmark Brent crude oil has soared to nearly $120 per barrel, approaching its historic high, driven by the combined disruptions of the Iran war and the Ukraine conflict. You feel that every time you fill up your gas tank. You feel it in the price of everything that gets transported by truck or plane or ship. The global economy runs on energy, and energy is now the central battleground of this expanding conflict. Unlike the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war's disruptions, which the global energy system managed to absorb through rerouting and substitution, the 2026 disruptions involve physical choke points that cannot be compensated for, pushing markets beyond adjustment mechanisms into forced demand destruction and structural reconfiguration. That is academic language for something very plain. People are going to pay more, consume less, and see their economies squeezed in ways that will have political consequences all over the world, including right here in the United States. And there is a deeper moral and civilizational question buried inside all of these numbers and military assessments. What does it mean when the global order that the United States spent 80 years building, an order based on international law, on the inviolability of borders, on the idea that disputes get resolved through diplomacy and not through conquest, what does it mean when that order is being dismantled piece by piece? Russia crossed a border with tanks and missiles, killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions more, and is still sitting at a negotiating table demanding that its territorial gains be legitimized. If that succeeds, even partially, the precedent it sets will echo for decades. Every rising power with territorial ambitions will look at that outcome and draw the obvious conclusion. The rules are not real, power is real. Violence works. Since retreating from Kyiv in April 2022, Russia has now failed in 4 of its 5 strategic objectives: political subjugation of Ukraine, economic sustainability, regime stability, and international standing. Only in territorial control does it hold a Pyrrhic advantage. A declining power is often more dangerous than a rising one. A Russia that is losing but not yet broken is a Russia that reaches for its most extreme tools. That is the danger zone we are in right now. And the oil fires burning along the Baltic Sea this week are both a symptom of that danger and a potential accelerant of it. Ukraine is fighting with extraordinary courage and with a strategic sophistication that continues to surprise the world. It has turned drone warfare into an art form, intercepting 91% of Russian drones, while simultaneously projecting its own offensive capacity deep into Russian territory, hitting oil refineries 800 kilometers from its border, striking shadow fleet tankers in the Mediterranean and near Istanbul, and now taking down the infrastructure that feeds the Kremlin's treasury. This is not the Ukraine of 2022, overwhelmed and desperate. This is a nation that has militarized itself with astonishing speed and is now fighting a war on economic, maritime, and battlefield dimensions simultaneously. But here is the cold truth that nobody in Washington or Brussels wants to say out loud. Ukraine cannot win this war through attrition alone if Russia keeps receiving North Korean troops, Iranian drone technology, and Chinese economic support. The global coalition sustaining Russian war-making capacity is real, and it is not going away. And the global coalition sustaining Ukraine, while formidable, is being tested by political fatigue, by the distraction of the Iran war, and by the uncertainty of American political will. Washington's unwillingness to antagonize Moscow will undermine a strong NATO response, providing more room for Russian probing and raising the risk of a direct confrontation between European defense forces and Russia. That is not a fringe analysis. That is the assessment of Eurasia Group, one of the most respected geopolitical risk firms on the planet. The oil fires burning in Russia's Leningrad Oblast this week are a window into the nature of the war we are actually living in. This is not a simple story of good versus evil, though there are genuine moral stakes. This is a story of a global order under maximum stress, of energy systems being weaponized, of drone technology democratizing the ability to project destructive force across hundreds of miles, of nuclear powers testing each other's red lines with a cold and calculated precision. And it is a story that is not over. It is not slowing down. Russia has been scaling up its drone production from 90 per day last July to over 400 per day by January 2026. Ukraine has matched it. The industrial logic of this conflict is one of continuous escalation, of each side trying to outproduce and outdestroy the other. The world is not the same place it was 5 years ago. The rules are being rewritten in real time, in fire and smoke, over Baltic ports and Strait of Hormuz choke points and frozen trenches in eastern Ukraine. And the question for every American who genuinely cares about what kind of world we are leaving behind, for our children, for the global order, for the idea that international law is not just a polite fiction, is not whether to pay attention to this. The question is whether we are paying enough attention and whether we understand deeply enough what the fires in Russia's oil country actually mean for the future we are all about to inherit.